The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Miller's truck stop, where diesel fumes mixed with the aroma of burnt coffee and broken dreams. Jake Morrison stood beside his battered 1987 Peterbilt 379, its chrome dulled by a million miles of highway dust, watching the mechanics at Sullivan's premium auto service shake their heads and snicker behind their pristine bay doors. "You serious about this, Morrison?" Tommy Sullivan called out, his voice carrying that particular brand of small-town condescension that Jake had grown to despise. Tommy wiped his hands on a rag that probably cost more than Jake's monthly truck payment, his designer coveralls spotless despite claiming to be a working mechanic. "You want to open a truck repair shop? Here? In Millbrook?" The laughter that erupted from the three other mechanics felt like sandpaper against Jake's weathered skin. He'd heard that sound before, in high school when he talked about going to college, at the bank when he'd applied for his first business loan, from his ex-wife when he dreamed aloud about something bigger than the endless cycle of loading docks and way stations. "That's right," Jake said, his voice steady despite the familiar burn of humiliation rising in his chest. "Been saving for 15 years. Got the land, got the plans, got the determination." "Determination don't fix transmissions, old man," laughed Rick Castellano, Sullivan's lead mechanic, a guy who'd never driven anything bigger than his lifted F-150, but somehow felt qualified to judge Jake's ambitions. "You think truckers are going to bring their rigs to some has-been driver working out of a glorified shed?" The words hit harder than they should have. Jake was 47, not ancient, but in the trucking world that was getting long in the tooth. His back ached from decades of climbing in and out of cabs, his knees creaked like old hinges, and his hands were permanently stained with grease and diesel fuel. But his mind was sharp, his skills were solid, and his heart was full of something these polished pretty boys would never understand: the deep, abiding love for the machines that kept America moving. "Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but I'm going to find out." Tommy Sullivan stepped closer, his cologne mixing uncomfortably with the garage smells. He was everything Jake wasn't: inherited money, clean fingernails, and the kind of smooth confidence that came from never having to worry where your next meal was coming from. "Look, Morrison, I'm trying to help you here. You're embarrassing yourself. Trucking is a dying industry anyway. Everything's going autonomous. Save yourself the heartache and stick to what you know: driving." "Autonomous trucks still need mechanics," Jake replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The truth was he'd been thinking that same thing during those long midnight hauls across empty interstates. How much longer did guys like him have? How much longer before the highways were filled with computer-controlled 18-wheelers that never needed sleep, never made mistakes, never dreamed of something better? "Not mechanics like you," Rick chimed in, earning another round of laughter. "They need engineers, programmers, guys with college degrees and clean overalls, not some broken-down gear-jamming dinosaur." Jake felt something inside him crack, the way ice breaks on a lake in early spring, suddenly, completely, with a sound that echoes long after the damage is done. He'd heard worse things, endured harsher words, but there was something about standing in this pristine garage, surrounded by these men who'd never fought to keep a rig running in sub-zero temperatures or nursed a dying engine across 3 states, that made their dismissal feel particularly cruel. "We'll see," is all he managed to say, before turning away, his boots heavy on the polished concrete floor. As he climbed back into his Peterbilt, Jake caught sight of himself in the side mirror: gray stubble, crow's feet, etched deep from squinting into a million sunrises. A face that told a story of every mile he'd driven. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was fooling himself. Maybe a man his age, with his background, had no business dreaming of owning something, building something, becoming something more than just another trucker counting down the days until his body gave out. The engine coughed to life, that familiar rumble that had been his soundtrack for over 20 years. Jake pulled out of Sullivan's lot slowly, feeling their eyes on him, hearing their laughter fade into the distance. But instead of heading for the interstate and his next load, he turned toward the outskirts of town, toward the 23 acres he'd scraped together the down payment for, toward the dream they'd just tried to kill. The land sat at the end of Elm Creek Road, a stretch of rolling hills that most people considered worthless, too rocky for farming, too remote for development, too ordinary for anyone to care about. But Jake saw potential in the way the morning light hit the oak trees, in the natural depression that would be perfect for a service bay, and the small creek that ran along the eastern boundary, providing the kind of peace a man needed after dealing with people like Tommy Sullivan. He parked the Peterbilt under the largest oak and walked the perimeter, as he did every few days, visualizing where everything would go. The main shop here, with room for 3 bays. The office there, modest but professional. A small apartment upstairs where he could live while building the business, cutting overhead, proving to everyone, including himself, that he could make this work. The surveyor's stakes were still in place from his initial site inspection, bright orange flags marking the boundaries of his future. Jacob studied every inch of this property, knew where the water table sat, where the bedrock started, where the soil was most stable. He'd learned that knowledge the hard way, through years of breakdowns in strange places, having to diagnose problems by feel and instinct when the nearest dealer was 500 miles away. As he walked, Jake's phone buzzed, a text from his dispatcher. Got a load of steel pipe heading to Phoenix, need you to roll by noon. Another cross-country haul, another week away from home, another delay in getting started on the shop. But the money was necessary. Every mile driven was another dollar toward making this dream real. He was heading back to the truck when something caught his eye. Near the center of the property, where he planned to put the main service bay, the ground looked different, settled somehow, as if the earth had compressed over time. Jake had noticed it before, but hadn't given it much thought. Now, standing in the spot where Tommy Sullivan's laughter still echoed in his memory, he found himself really looking at it for the first time. The depression wasn't natural, too regular, too purposeful. It was roughly rectangular, maybe 40 feet by 60 feet, and about 2 feet lower than the surrounding grade. Grass grew over it, wildflowers dotted its surface, but underneath, Jake's experienced eye could see the telltale signs of old excavation work. Someone had dug here a long time ago, and then filled it back in. He knelt down and scraped away some of the topsoil with his pocket knife. The dirt underneath was different, darker, looser, mixed with fragments of concrete and what looked like rusted metal. Jake's pulse quickened. As a trucker, he'd developed an instinct for reading the land, for spotting the signs that told a story about what came before. This spot was telling him something important. His phone buzzed again, another text from the dispatcher, more insistent this time. Jake looked at his truck, then back at the mysterious depression, feeling torn between the immediate need for income and the growing curiosity about his land's hidden history. The Phoenix run would pay well, enough to move his construction timeline up by a month. But this discovery, whatever it was, felt significant in a way he couldn't yet articulate.
Jake made a decision that would change everything, though he couldn't have known it at the time. He called his dispatcher and told them he was taking a sick day. Then he drove into town, ignoring the looks from Sullivan's crew as he passed their shop, and rented a small excavator from Millbrook Equipment. "You sure you know how to operate this thing, Morrison?" asked Pete Kowalski, the rental manager, as they loaded the compact machine onto Jake's trailer. Pete was one of the few people in town who didn't treat Jake like a curiosity or a failure, maybe because he'd spent some time on the road himself before settling down. "Ran plenty of heavy equipment in my younger days," Jake replied, which was true. Before trucking had claimed him, he'd worked construction, operated everything from backhoes to bulldozers. "Just want to do some site prep work, maybe get a head start on the foundation." Pete nodded, understanding the hunger to build something, to create something lasting. "Take your time with her. She's got good hydraulics, but she'll buck if you push too hard." By late afternoon, Jake had the excavator positioned over the mysterious depression. The Phoenix load would have to wait. Tommy Sullivan's laughter would have to echo unanswered for a while longer. Something about this patch of earth demanded his attention, called to him in a way he couldn't ignore. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across his property, Jake Morrison started the excavator and lowered the bucket toward the ground. He couldn't have imagined that with each scoop of earth he was about to uncover, he was digging his way toward the kind of vindication that would make Tommy Sullivan's cruel laughter sound like the sweetest music he'd ever heard. The first bite of the bucket revealed nothing more than roots and rocks, but Jake kept digging, driven by an instinct that had served him well on 1,000,000 miles of highway. A feeling that the best discoveries often came to those patient enough to keep moving forward even when the road ahead seemed empty. The excavator's hydraulics hissed and groaned as Jake worked through the first layer of soil, each bucketful revealing more questions than answers. By the time the sun had painted the sky in shades of amber and rust, he'd managed to clear about 10 feet of the mysterious depression, exposing what was definitely old concrete, thick, industrial-grade stuff that spoke of serious construction, not some backyard project. Jake shut down the machine and climbed out, his knees protesting the unfamiliar motion. Driving a truck kept different muscles active than operating heavy equipment, and at 47, his body was quick to remind him of every deviation from routine. He walked to the edge of his excavation, studying the concrete surface he'd uncovered. It was smooth, purposeful, with what looked like anchor bolts still embedded at regular intervals. His phone had been buzzing intermittently all afternoon, dispatch probably, wondering where their reliable driver had disappeared to. Jake ignored it, lost in the mystery beneath his feet. This wasn't just a foundation. The concrete was too thick, too reinforced. It looked like a floor, built to support serious weight. As darkness crept across the property, Jake reluctantly fired up his Peterbilt and headed back to town. The Phoenix load would have to wait another day, which meant another conversation with his dispatcher, another mark against his reliability record. But something about what he'd found wouldn't let him walk away. The Millbrook diner was nearly empty when Jake pushed through the door, the familiar smell of fried food and stale coffee wrapping around him like an old blanket. Betty Kowalski, Pete's wife and the diner's owner for 30 years, looked up from behind the counter with a knowing smile.
"Let me guess," she said, pouring coffee into a heavy ceramic mug without being asked. "You're the crazy trucker who rented excavation equipment today." Jake slumped onto a stool, suddenly feeling every one of his years. "News travels fast in a small town." "Faster than your truck, apparently," Betty chuckled, sliding the coffee toward him. "Pete mentioned you were doing some site prep work. How's that going?" Jake wrapped his hands around the mug, grateful for its warmth. October evenings in Indiana had a bite to them, and he'd spent the day in nothing but his work shirt. "Found something interesting. Old concrete work. Really old by the looks of it." Betty's expression shifted slightly, a shadow passing across her weathered features. She'd lived in Millbrook her entire life, had seen the town grow and shrink and change in ways that only long-time residents understood. "Where exactly are you digging, Jake?" "Out on Elm Creek Road, the Henderson property." The coffee pot slipped from Betty's hand, hitting the counter with a sharp crack. Coffee splashed across the formica surface, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes had gone wide, focused on something beyond Jake's shoulder, beyond the present moment. "The Henderson place," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake, you need to stop digging." "What? Why?" Jake leaned forward, studying her face. Betty Kowalski wasn't the type to get rattled easily. In 30 years of serving truckers, farmers, and drifters, she'd heard every story, seen every type of trouble that rolled through town. But right now, she looked genuinely frightened.
Betty began mopping up the spilled coffee, her movements quick and nervous. "That property? It has a history, Jake. A complicated history." "What kind of history?" Before Betty could answer, the diner's door chimed, and Tommy Sullivan walked in, followed by two of his mechanics. Their laughter died when they saw Jake sitting at the counter, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Well, well," Tommy said, sliding onto a stool 3 seats down from Jake, "if it isn't Millbrook's future truck repair mogul. Heard you took a day off from driving to play with heavy equipment." Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Just doing some site work." "Site work?" Rick Castellano laughed, settling beside his boss. "More like grave digging. You're burying your dreams before you even get started, Morrison." The third mechanic, a younger guy Jake didn't recognize, spoke up. "Maybe he's digging for buried treasure. I heard truckers believe in all kinds of crazy stuff. UFOs, Bigfoot, government conspiracies." Their laughter filled the small diner, but Jake noticed Betty wasn't joining in. She was watching him with those worried eyes, occasionally glancing toward the windows as if expecting something unwelcome to appear in the darkness beyond. "You boys want the usual?" Betty asked, her voice strained but professional. As the mechanics placed their order, Jake found himself studying Tommy Sullivan more closely. There was something different about him tonight, a tension that hadn't been there that morning. His usual cocky confidence was still there, but underneath it, Jake detected something else. Nervousness, maybe, or concern. "So, Morrison," Tommy said, turning on his stool to face Jake directly, "what exactly are you hoping to find out there on the old Henderson place?"
The question felt loaded, purposeful. Jake sipped his coffee, considering his words carefully. "Just preparing the site for construction. Nothing mysterious about it." "Construction," Rick snorted. "Right, and I'm NASCAR material." But Tommy wasn't laughing. His eyes remained fixed on Jake, studying him the way a mechanic might study an engine making unusual noises. "You know, Morrison, that property has been sitting empty for what, Betty? 30 years?" "About that," Betty replied quietly, her attention focused intently on cleaning glasses that were already spotless. 30 years, Tommy repeated. "Makes you wonder why nobody's ever developed it, doesn't it? Prime real estate, good road access, reasonable price, but it just sits there, year after year, with nobody showing any interest." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Maybe people just don't see the potential. Or maybe, Tommy said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, they know something you don't. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with implications Jake couldn't quite grasp. Betty had stopped moving entirely, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. The younger mechanic was looking back and forth between Tommy and Jake like he was watching a tennis match, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Finally, Rick broke the silence. "Come on, boss, you're scaring the old man. Next thing you know, he'll be seeing ghosts out there." Tommy's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ghosts, right. Just be careful out there, Morrison. Some things are better left buried." The mechanics finished their meal quickly after that, the earlier jovial mood replaced by something darker. As they prepared to leave, Tommy lingered by Jake's stool. "You know," he said quietly, so only Jake could hear, "I wasn't just being cruel this morning about you not being cut out for the repair business. I was trying to help you. There are easier ways to make a living than what you're attempting." "I appreciate the concern," Jake replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Do you? Because I don't think you understand what you're getting into. The repair business, the property you bought, the complications that might arise. Maybe you should consider selling that land and
sticking to what you know. Jake turned to face Tommy directly. Are you making me an offer? For just a moment, Tommy's mask slipped, revealing something that looked like desperation. I might be, if you're interested in making a profit without all the hassle of construction, permits, zoning issues, other complications. What kind of complications? He glanced towards Betty, who was pretending not to listen, but clearly hanging on every word. The kind that can ruin a man's life if he's not careful. Think about it, Morrison. I'll be in touch. After the mechanics left, the diner fell into an uncomfortable silence. Jake stared into his coffee, his mind racing with questions and half-formed suspicions. Betty moved around behind the counter, her earlier nervous energy replaced by something that looked like resignation. Betty, Jake said finally, what happened on that property? What's everyone so afraid of? Betty sighed, the sound seeming to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Jake, her weathered hands wrapped around the mug like it was an anchor. The Henderson place, she began, her voice quiet but steady. It used to belong to Earl Henderson. This was back in the 50s and 60s, when Earl was running the biggest trucking operation in 3 counties. Henderson Transport. Maybe you've heard of it?
Jake nodded. Every trucker knew the old company names, the pioneers who'd built the industry from nothing. Henderson Transport had been legendary, one of the first operations to run coast-to-coast routes, to really understand that trucking was going to revolutionize American commerce. Earl was a visionary, Betty continued, but he was also paranoid. He'd survived the Depression, fought in World War II, and he'd seen what could happen when things went bad. So when he started making real money in the trucking business, he didn't trust banks, didn't trust the government, didn't trust anyone but himself. She paused, staring out the window at the dark street beyond. Earl started collecting things. Not just money, though there was plenty of that. He collected trucks. The finest, most beautiful trucks ever built. Classics, customs, one-of-a-kind machines that were more art than transportation. He kept them in a special facility he built out on his property. Jake's pulse quickened. What kind of facility? Underground. Earl was convinced that eventually there'd be another depression, maybe another war. He wanted to protect his collection, keep it safe from whatever might come. So he excavated a massive underground garage reinforced with steel and concrete, climate-controlled, with its own power supply. The pieces were starting to fit together in Jake's mind. The thick concrete floor, the anchor bolts, the purposeful construction. What happened to it? Betty's expression grew darker. Earl died in 1962, sudden heart attack. His son inherited everything, but the boy was more interested in selling the business than preserving his father's collection. The underground garage was expensive to maintain, and nobody really knew what to do with all those trucks. So they sold them? That's what everyone assumed. The son claimed he'd liquidated the collection, paid off the business debts, and moved to California with the proceeds. The underground garage was sealed up, filled with dirt, and the property was eventually sold. Jakes felt a strange tingling in his chest, a sensation he'd learned to trust over 20 years of highway driving. But you don't think that's what really happened? Betty met his eyes, and in them, Jake saw something that looked like fear mixed with anticipation. Earl Henderson was obsessive about those trucks. He spent more money collecting them than most people made in a lifetime. And his son? Well, let's just say the boy was more interested in fast cars and fast women than preservation. You think the trucks are still there? I think, Betty said carefully, that Earl Henderson's son took the easy way out. I think he told everyone he'd sold the collection, sealed up the garage with everything still inside, and used the insurance money to fund his new life in California. Jake's mind was reeling. If Betty was right, if the underground garage still contained Earl Henderson's legendary truck collection, then he might have just stumbled onto something extraordinary. Classic trucks from the 1940s and 50s, if they'd been properly preserved, could be worth— "How much do you think a collection like that would be worth today?" he asked quietly. Betty shrugged, but there was something in her expression that suggested she'd thought about this question before. Earl was collecting for 20 years, buying only the finest examples. Pristine Kenworths, custom Peterbilts, one-off Macs that were built for show more than work. If they're still down there, if they've been preserved— She shook her head. "I don't even want to guess." Jake's phone buzzed again. Another message from dispatch. This time he looked at it. "Morrison, you're scheduled for Phoenix Run tomorrow at 6 a.m. Confirm receipt." He stared at the message, feeling torn between the immediate need for income and the possibility of something that could change his life forever. The Phoenix Run would pay $3,000, enough to move his construction timeline up significantly. But if there really was a collection of vintage trucks buried beneath his property— "Betty," he said, "who else knows about this?"
Her expression grew troubled. More people than you might think. Earl's collection was well known back in the day, and his son's sudden departure raised eyebrows. Over the years, there have been rumors, speculation, even a few people who've tried to buy the property just to investigate. Like who? Betty glanced toward the window again, as if checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. Tommy Sullivan's family has been interested in that property for years. His grandfather tried to buy it in the 70s. His father made offers in the 80s and 90s. Tommy himself has approached every owner since then. Jake felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. That's why he was so insistent that I not try to develop it. And why he's offering to buy it from you now, Betty added. The Sullivan family knows exactly what might be buried out there, Jake. They've been waiting decades for the right opportunity to get their hands on it. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. If the Sullivan family had been trying to acquire his property for decades, if they knew about Earl Henderson's collection, then his discovery that afternoon wasn't just lucky. It was potentially life-changing in ways he was only beginning to understand. But it also meant he was in competition with people who had more money, more connections, and a much longer history with the secret he'd stumbled onto. Tommy Sullivan wasn't just a condescending mechanic with family money. He was a man who'd been planning for this moment for most of his life. Jake looked at his phone again, at the message from dispatch. $3,000 for the Phoenix Run, or the possibility of something worth, what, millions? Tens of millions? "I need to keep digging," he said finally. But he nodded, but her expression remained worried. "Jake, if you're going to do this, you need to be careful. The Sullivan family has a long reach in this town, and they're not going to just stand by and watch you uncover something they've been after for 30 years. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Earl Henderson wasn't the only one who was paranoid, and sometimes paranoia is just good sense." Jake finished his coffee and stood up, his decision made. The Phoenix Run would have to wait. Tomorrow, he was going back to his property with the excavator, and he was going to find out once and for all what Earl Henderson had left behind. As he headed for the door, Betty called after him, "Jake, be careful who you trust, and whatever you find out there, maybe don't tell everyone about it right away." Walking out into the cool October night, Jake felt the weight of possibility and danger settling on his shoulders like a familiar jacket. 20 years of highway driving had taught him that the most interesting roads were often the most treacherous ones. But sometimes, those were also the roads that led to exactly where you needed to be. Jake Morrison didn't sleep that night. He lay in his small apartment above the Route 9 truck wash, staring at the ceiling while 18-wheelers rumbled past on the interstate, their Jake brakes hissing in the darkness like mechanical prayers. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that concrete floor, those anchor bolts, the purposeful construction that spoke of something significant buried beneath his property. By 4:30 a.m., he'd given up on sleep entirely. He brewed coffee in the tiny kitchenette, called his dispatcher to officially turn down the Phoenix run, earning himself a lecture about reliability and professionalism, and headed back to route Elm Creek Road while the stars were still visible in the pre-dawn sky. The excavator started on the first try, its diesel engine coughing to life in the cold morning air. Jake had been operating heavy machinery for more than half his life, but today his hands trembled slightly as he positioned the bucket over yesterday's work. Whatever lay beneath this concrete could change everything: his future, his financial situation, his entire understanding of what was possible for a man like him.
The first few hours revealed more of the concrete floor, stretching much further than he'd initially estimated. By the time the sun had burned off the morning mist, Jake had exposed nearly 1,000 square feet of purposeful construction. The concrete was at least 8 inches thick, reinforced with steel mesh and designed to support tremendous weight. But more importantly, he'd found what looked like the outline of a massive overhead door, its track systems still embedded in the concrete. Jake shut down the excavator and walked the perimeter of his discovery, his excitement building with each step. This wasn't just a garage, it was an underground hangar designed to house something large and valuable. The dimensions were staggering, at least 40 feet wide by 80 feet long, with concrete walls extending down at least 10 feet from what he could see. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Heard you're doing some interesting excavation work. Would love to discuss a business proposition. T. Sullivan." Jake stared at the message, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. How had Tommy gotten his number? More importantly, how did he already know about the morning's progress? Jake looked around the property, suddenly aware of how exposed he was, how easily someone could observe his work from the road or the surrounding hills. Instead of responding to the text, Jake climbed back into the excavator and continued digging. By noon, he'd exposed what was clearly a ramp leading down into the underground structure. The concrete was discolored here, stained with decades of seepage and organic matter, but the construction remained solid. More importantly, he could see that the ramp had been blocked, not with natural settling, but with deliberate backfill that included chunks of concrete and twisted metal, as if someone had wanted to make sure this entrance stayed closed. Jake was studying the blocked ramp when he heard vehicles approaching on Elm Creek Road. 2 pickup trucks and a sedan, moving slowly, purposefully. He recognized Tommy Sullivan's pristine F-250 in the lead, followed by vehicles he didn't know. The convoy pulled up to the edge of his property and stopped, engines running. Tommy got out of his truck, followed by 4 other men Jake didn't recognize. These guys wore expensive boots, clean jeans, and the kind of casual confidence that came from never having to worry about where their next paycheck was coming from. "Morrison?" Tommy called, his voice carrying across the excavation site. "Impressive work you're doing here. Mind if we take a look?" Jake remained in the excavator's cab, his hand resting on the ignition key. "This is private property, Sullivan. You're trespassing." Tommy laughed, but it wasn't the cruel sound from yesterday's encounter at the diner. This was something colder, more calculating. "Come on, Jake, we're all friends here. Just curious neighbors checking out the local development project." One of the men with Tommy stepped forward. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and the weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. But his clothes were expensive, his posture confident, and when he spoke, there was authority in his voice. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Frank Sullivan, Tommy's father. I think it's time we had a conversation."
Jake had heard of Frank Sullivan, though they'd never met. The man owned half the commercial real estate in Millbrook, sat on the town council, and had the kind of local influence that came from 3 generations of successful business dealings. Seeing him here, on Jake's property, surrounded by men who looked more like private security than casual observers, sent warning bells ringing in Jake's head. "What kind of conversation?" Jake called back, still not leaving the excavator's cab. Frank walked closer to the excavation. his eyes taking in every detail of Jake's work. When he looked up, his expression was thoughtful, almost impressed, the kind where we discuss the future of this property and everyone's best interests. "My interests seem pretty clear," Jake replied. "I'm building a truck repair shop." "Are you?" Frank gestured toward the exposed concrete. "Because this looks like something else entirely. This looks like you've stumbled onto a piece of local history that's been sleeping for 30 years. The admission was stunning in its directness. Frank Sullivan wasn't pretending ignorance or playing games. He knew exactly what Jake had found, and he wasn't trying to hide it. Jake shut down the excavator and climbed down, but he stayed close to the machine, ready to use it as a barrier if necessary. "What do you know about this, Sullivan?" Frank smiled, the expression both friendly and predatory. "I know that Earl Henderson was a brilliant but paranoid old man who didn't trust banks, governments, or anyone else with his most precious possessions. I know that when he died, his worthless son claimed to have sold a truck collection that was worth more than most people see in a lifetime. And I know that collection never left this property." "How can you be so sure?" "Because my father tried to buy these trucks in 1963, right after Earl's funeral. He offered the son top dollar, cash on the barrel head for the entire collection. The boy claimed everything had already been sold to a collector in Texas, but he couldn't produce any documentation, any shipping records, anything that proved that the trucks had actually left Indiana." Frank walked closer to the excavation, his eyes taking in every detail of Jake's work. When he looked up, his expression was thoughtful, almost impressed. "The kind where we discuss the future of this property and everyone's best interests." "My interests seem pretty clear," Jake replied. "I'm building a truck repair shop." "Are you?" Frank gestured toward the exposed concrete. "Because this looks like something else entirely. This looks like you've stumbled onto a piece of local history that's been sleeping for 30 years. The admission was stunning in its directness. Frank Sullivan wasn't pretending ignorance or playing games. He knew exactly what Jake had found, and he wasn't trying to hide it. Jake shut down the excavator and climbed down, but he stayed close to the machine, ready to use it as a barrier if necessary. "What do you know about this, Sullivan?" Frank smiled, the expression both friendly and predatory. "I know that Earl Henderson was a brilliant but paranoid old man who didn't trust banks, governments, or anyone else with his most precious possessions. I know that when he died, his worthless son claimed to have sold a truck collection that was worth more than most people see in a lifetime. And I know that collection never left this property." "How can you be so sure?" "Because my father tried to buy these trucks in 1963, right after Earl's funeral. He offered the son top dollar, cash on the barrel head for the entire collection. The boy claimed everything had already been sold to a collector in Texas, but he couldn't produce any documentation, any shipping records, anything that proved that the trucks had actually left Indiana." Frank walked closer to the excavation, his movements careful and deliberate. "My family has been researching this mystery for 60 years, Mr. Morrison. We know Earl Henderson's collection included 17 trucks. Kenworths, Peterbilts, Macs, and Freightliners that represented the absolute pinnacle of 1940s and 1950s trucking craftsmanship. We know he spent over $2 million acquiring them, which would be $20 million in today's money. And we know they never left this property." Jake felt his world shifting, the implications of Frank's words hitting him like a physical force. $20 million? In 1962 money, Frank corrected. Today, properly authenticated and restored, Earl Henderson's collection would be worth considerably more. One of the men with Frank stepped forward, and Jake noticed the bulge of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. "Mr. Morrison, my name is David Chen, and I represent the Sullivan family's business interests. We'd like to make you an offer for this property." "I'm not interested in selling." Chen smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You haven't heard the offer yet." Frank gestured for Chen to back off, then approached Jake directly. "Son, I'm going to be straight with you because I think you deserve honesty. My family has invested significant time and resources in researching this property. We've spent decades waiting for the right opportunity to explore what lies beneath this ground. You've accidentally stumbled onto something that could make you wealthy beyond your wildest dreams. But you've also put yourself in competition with people who have been planning for this moment since before you were born." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jake looked around at the men surrounding him, at their expensive clothes and confident demeanor, at the way they'd positioned themselves to control access to his property. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that developing Earl Henderson's collection properly requires expertise, connections, and resources that you don't have. Authentication, restoration, marketing to the right collectors. It's a complex process that could take years and cost millions. But done right, it could yield profits in excess of $200 million.
Jake's mind reeled. $200 million. It was more money than he'd ever dreamed of, more than most people could even comprehend. But Frank Sullivan's tone suggested there was a catch coming. "Of course," Frank continued, "there are significant risks involved. Legal complications, insurance issues, regulatory concerns. The kind of problems that could tie up a project in court for decades, or worse." "Worse how?" Frank's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Morrison, you seem like a decent man. You work hard, you've served your community as a professional driver, and you deserve to benefit from your good fortune. But you need to understand the realities of the situation. My family has connections throughout this county. Legal, political, regulatory. We know how to navigate the complexities of a discovery like this. More importantly, we know how to protect everyone involved." The implication was clear. Cooperate with the Sullivans or face the kind of legal and regulatory obstacles that could destroy him financially and personally. Jake looked down at the concrete floor he'd exposed, at the blocked ramp that led to whatever lay beneath. "What exactly are you offering?" Chen stepped forward again. 50-50 partnership. We handle all development costs, legal issues, and marketing. You provide the property and the discovery rights. Profits split equally after expenses. It was a generous offer, more generous than Jake would have expected. But something about the way they'd arrived here, the casual display of force, the underlying threats, made him hesitate. "I need to think about it." "Of course," Frank continued. "But Jake, may I call you Jake, time is a factor here. Word has a way of getting out in the small town, and once that happens, this site could become very complicated. Federal regulators, state archaeologists, tax authorities, they all take an interest in significant historical discoveries. Much better to handle this quietly, professionally, before it becomes a media circus." The message was clear. Accept their partnership or watch them use their connections to tie up the project in bureaucratic red tape until he was forced to surrender or go bankrupt fighting. "How long do I have to decide?" "Let's say 48 hours. That gives you time to consider your options while keeping this discovery contained." As the Sullivan group prepared to leave, Tommy lingered behind. "Jake, I want you to know this isn't personal. Yesterday at the diner, all that crap about you not being cut out for business, I was trying to discourage you from this exact situation. I knew what you might find out here, and I was hoping you'd take the hint and walk away before things got complicated." "Complicated how?" Tommy's glanced back towards his father and the other men, making sure they were out of earshot. "My family has been obsessed with Earl Henderson's collection since before I was born. My grandfather died believing those trucks were still buried out here. My father has spent his entire adult life researching, planning, positioning himself for the moment this property became accessible. And now you've handed them exactly what they've been waiting for. So why warn me?" Tommy's expression was genuinely conflicted. "Because, despite what you might think, I'm not a complete bastard. And because I've seen what happens to people who get in my family's way when they want something badly enough." The chill Jake felt had nothing to do with the October air. "What kind of things?"
"The kind of things that make 50-50 partnerships look very attractive," Tommy replied quietly. "Think about it, Jake. $200 million is life-changing money, but it's also the kind of money that makes people do desperate things."
After the Sullivans left, Jake stood alone in his excavation, surrounded by concrete and possibilities and the growing certainty that he was in over his head. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette, a habit he'd broken 5 years ago but suddenly needed again. The nicotine hit his bloodstream like a small electric shock, sharpening his focus and calming his nerves. $200 million. It was an almost incomprehensible sum, enough to transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone he cared about. But it was also the kind of money that destroyed people, that brought out the worst in human nature, that made decent folks do terrible things. Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Marcus Thompson had been his friend since high school, had served in the military before becoming one of the most successful independent truckers in the Midwest. More importantly, Marcus was smart, connected, and had navigated enough complex business deals to understand the implications of what Jake was facing. "Marcus, it's Jake Morrison. I need your advice on something, and I need you to keep it confidential." "Jake, what's going on? You sound like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have. Can you meet me tomorrow morning, early? I've got something to show you, and I need someone I trust to help me figure out what to do about it." Marcus agreed, and Jake spent the rest of the afternoon continuing his excavation work, driven by a mixture of excitement and dread that he couldn't shake. By evening, he'd exposed most of the ramp leading down into the underground structure, and he could see that the blockage wasn't as extensive as he had initially thought. With careful work, he might be able to clear an entrance within a day or two. But as Jake packed up his equipment and prepared to head back to town, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. The hills around his property offered dozens of vantage points, and the Sullivan family clearly had resources he couldn't match. If they wanted to monitor his progress, there was little he could do to stop them. That night at the diner, Betty Kowalski took one look at his face and poured coffee without being asked. "Rough day?" Jake glanced around the nearly empty restaurant, making sure they wouldn't be overheard. "The Sullivans paid me a visit. Frank Sullivan himself, with an entourage." Betty's face went pale. "What do they want?" "They want to be partners, 50-50 split of whatever I find down there." "And if you refuse?" Jake sipped his coffee, tasting the bitterness on his tongue. "They didn't say explicitly, but the message was clear. Cooperate or face the kind of legal and regulatory problems that could destroy me." Betty was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the dark street beyond. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake, there's something else you need to know about the Sullivan family and their interest in that property." "What?" "Frank's father, Tommy's grandfather, wasn't just interested in Earl Henderson's truck collection. He was Earl's business partner for a brief time in the early 1960s, right before Earl died. There were rumors about their partnership ending badly, about money that went missing, about Earl's sudden death not being as natural as everyone assumed."
Betty shrugged, but her expression was deeply troubled. "I think Earl Henderson discovered something about his business partner that made him dangerous to know. And I think that same business partner's family has been waiting 60 years for the chance to claim what they believe belongs to them." Jake's phone buzzed. Another text from Tommy Sullivan. "Hope you're seriously considering our offer. Time has a way of running out faster than people expect." Looking at the message, surrounded by the warm light and familiar smells of the diner, Jake Morrison realized that his simple dream of opening a truck repair shop had evolved into something much more complex and dangerous. He was no longer just a broke trucker with big plans. He was the accidental guardian of a $200 million secret that powerful people had been coveting for most of his lifetime. And tomorrow morning, he was going to find out exactly what Earl Henderson had hidden beneath the Indiana soil, regardless of the consequences. The question was, would he live long enough to enjoy whatever treasures lay waiting in that underground cathedral of automotive history?
As Jake headed back to his apartment that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the next 48 hours would determine not just his financial future, but possibly his survival. The October wind carried the scent of approaching winter, and somewhere in that cold darkness, Jake Morrison prepared to make the kind of decision that would echo through the rest of his life. Whatever lay beneath that concrete floor, whatever Earl Henderson had hidden in his underground sanctuary, Jake was going to see it with his own eyes before he decided to trust the Sullivan family with the discovery of a lifetime, even if that decision killed him. Marcus Thompson arrived at 5:30 a.m., his custom Peterbilt 389 rumbling to a stop beside Jake's excavation site just as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and amber. Marcus was everything Jake aspired to be, successful, respected, with a trucking operation that generated millions in annual revenue. But more importantly, he was loyal, honest, and smart enough to navigate the treacherous waters of big-money business deals without losing his soul. "Jesus Christ, Jake," Marcus said, climbing down from his cab and studying the exposed concrete floor. "When you said you'd found something interesting, I figured you meant maybe some old farm equipment. This looks like you've uncovered a missile silo." Jake handed him a cup of coffee from the thermos he'd brought. "It's bigger than that, Marcus. A lot bigger." Over the next hour, Jake explained everything: the Henderson family history, the Sullivan family's threats, the potential value of whatever lay beneath the concrete. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. $200 million? Marcus repeated when Jake finished. "That's generational wealth, Jake. That's the kind of money that changes everything." "I know, but it's also the kind of money that gets people killed, especially when families like the Sullivans have been waiting 60 years to get their hands on it." Marcus walked the perimeter of the excavation, his trained eye taking in details Jake had missed. This ramp system, the way it's constructed, whoever built this knew what they were doing. This isn't just storage space, it's a preservation facility, climate-controlled, moisture-sealed, designed to keep whatever's down there in perfect condition. The question is, what exactly is down there? Marcus pointed to the blocked entrance. "Only one way to find out. But Jake, before we do anything else, we need legal protection. The Sullivans aren't just going to walk away from this, and if they're as connected as you say, they'll use every trick in the book to take this away from you." Jake had been thinking the same thing all night. "I called a lawyer in Indianapolis, Sarah Chen, who specializes in property and mineral rights. She's driving down this morning." "Good, but we also need documentation of everything we find. Video, photographs, detailed inventory. If this goes to court, you'll need proof of exactly what was here and when you discovered it." They spent the morning carefully removing the debris blocking the ramp entrance. The work was delicate, requiring the excavator's precision controls to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath. As they cleared away decades of accumulated earth and concrete rubble, Jake began to see evidence of what Frank Sullivan had described. This hadn't been a natural cave-in, but a deliberate sealing operation. By noon, they'd exposed enough of the entrance to see into the underground structure. Marcus positioned his truck to block the view from the road, while Jake rigged up a portable LED light system. What they saw when those lights illuminated the space below took their breath away. The underground facility was enormous, a cathedral-like space that stretched nearly 100 feet in length and 40 feet in width, with a vaulted concrete ceiling that rose 15 feet at its highest point. But it wasn't the architecture that made them gasp, it was what filled the space. 17 trucks sat in perfect formation along the length of the underground garage, each one positioned on its own custom platform, each one representing the absolute pinnacle of 1940s and 1950s American trucking craftsmanship. Even in the harsh LED light, even covered with 60 years of dust and neglect, they were magnificent. "My God," Marcus whispered, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Jake, do you have any idea what you're looking at?" Jake was already climbing down into the garage, his heart pounding with excitement and disbelief. The nearest truck was a 1948 Kenworth 521, its long hood and distinctive grille design marking it as one of the legendary Bullnose series. The chrome was tarnished but intact, the paint dulled but original, the overall condition suggesting that Earl Henderson's preservation systems had worked better than anyone could have hoped. "Is that?" Marcus began, pointing to a truck near the center of the formation. Jake followed his gaze and felt his knees go weak. 1953 Peterbilt 350. Custom cab, chrome exhaust stacks, hand-painted pinstriping. He walked closer, studying the details that set this truck apart from every other 350 ever built. "Marcus, this isn't just any Peterbilt. This is the Golden Eagle." Marcus's face went pale. Every serious truck enthusiast knew the legend of the Golden Eagle, a one-off custom Peterbilt built for a Texas oil millionaire, featuring gold-plated hardware, hand-tooled leather interior, and custom bodywork that had cost more than most people's houses. It had disappeared in the 1950s, and most experts assumed it had been scrapped decades ago. "If that's really the Golden Eagle," Marcus said quietly, "it's worth $20 million by itself." They moved through the collection in stunned silence, documenting each truck with Marcus's high-end camera equipment. A 1949 Mack L series with a custom sleeper cab, a 1951 Freightliner WFT with original paint and chrome, a 1947 Kenworth 524 that looked like it had rolled off the assembly line yesterday. Each truck represented not just monetary value, but a piece of American industrial history that had been presumed lost forever. But it was the truck at the far end of the garage that made Jake's hands shake as he approached it. A 1950 Peterbilt 281 painted in deep blue with silver flames along the sides, its chrome bumper polished to mirror brightness despite 6 decades underground. Jake recognized it immediately from the photographs he had studied as a young man, learning about trucking history. "Blue Thunder," he whispered. Marcus looked up from the vintage Mack he had been photographing. "What did you say?" "Blue Thunder. This is Carl Morrison's truck." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Carl Morrison was a legend in trucking circles, one of the first independent owner-operators to run coast-to-coast routes, a pioneer who'd helped establish many of the practices that defined modern long-haul trucking. But more importantly to Jake, Carl Morrison had been his grandfather. "Your grandfather's truck is here?" Jake nodded, unable to speak. He'd grown up hearing stories about Blue Thunder, about the adventures his grandfather had experienced crossing the country in the days when trucking was still a rough-and-tumble frontier profession. The truck had been sold after Carl's death in 1962, and the family had always assumed it had been scrapped or forgotten. But here it was, preserved in this underground cathedral like a shrine to trucking's golden age. Jake climbed into the cab, his hands trembling as he touched the steering wheel his grandfather had gripped thousands of times. The interior was exactly as he remembered from childhood photographs. Red leather seats, custom dashboard, even the St. Christopher medallion still hanging from the rearview mirror. "Earl Henderson must have bought it from your family after your grandfather died," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe he knew about the connection. Maybe he just recognized its historical value." Jake found himself thinking about the timing. His grandfather's death in 1962, Earl Henderson's death later that same year, both men passing away just as the trucking industry was beginning its transformation into the modern freight transportation system. It felt like more than coincidence. It felt like destiny. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Time's running short, Mr. Morrison. Some discoveries are too important to leave in amateur hands. F. Sullivan." Jake showed the message to Marcus, who frowned as he read it. "They're monitoring your communications, Jake. This situation is more dangerous than we thought." "What do you mean?" Professional surveillance, real-time intelligence gathering. That's not something local mechanics arrange on their own. The Sullivan family has serious resources behind them, maybe federal connections. Before Jake could respond, they heard vehicles approaching on Elm Creek Road. Multiple engines, moving fast, getting closer. Marcus quickly shut off the LED lights, plunging the underground garage into darkness. "Jake, we need to get out of here, now." They climbed out of the garage and saw a convoy approaching. 3 black SUVs and a white van, moving with the kind of precision that suggested professional operation. Jake recognized Tommy Sullivan's truck bringing up the rear, but the other vehicles were unfamiliar, official-looking. "Federal marshals," Marcus said grimly, studying the lead SUV through binoculars. This just became a federal case. The convoy stopped at the edge of Jake's property, and armed men in tactical gear began taking positions around the excavation site. A man in an expensive suit emerged from the lead SUV, followed by Frank Sullivan and what looked like a team of lawyers and accountants. "Mr. Morrison," the suit called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Agent David Walsh, FBI. We need to talk." "What's this about?" "It's about a significant archaeological discovery that may involve interstate commerce violations, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges dating back 60 years. It's about the fact that your excavation has uncovered evidence in a federal investigation." Frank Sullivan stepped forward, his expression a mixture of triumph and concern. "Jake, I tried to warn you. This discovery is too significant to handle privately. The federal government has legitimate interests here: cultural preservation, tax compliance, interstate commerce regulations." "You called them?" Jake said, the betrayal hitting him like a physical blow. "I called people who could ensure this collection receives proper protection and evaluation," Frank replied. "People who can navigate the legal complexities without exposing everyone involved to criminal liability."
Agent Walsh approached the excavation site, studying the exposed trucks with obvious interest. "Mr. Morrison, you've uncovered what appears to be one of the most significant automotive archaeology finds in American history, but you've also potentially violated several federal statutes in the process." "What statutes?" "Failure to report discovery of items potentially subject to federal estate taxes, disturbing a site that may contain evidence relevant to ongoing federal investigations, possible possession of stolen property." The charges were obviously trumped up, designed to pressure Jake into cooperation rather than reflecting any real criminal activity. But they were also potentially devastating. Even defending against false federal charges could bankrupt him and tie up the discovery for years. Tommy Sullivan approached, his expression genuinely apologetic. "Jake, my father's trying to protect you here. Work with us, accept the partnership, and these federal issues can be resolved quietly. Fight us, and this becomes a media circus that destroys everyone involved." Jake looked around at the federal agents, the lawyers, the tactical teams, and the Sullivan family representatives. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and outlawyered by people who'd been planning this moment for decades. But he was also standing on his own land, beside a discovery he'd made through his own hard work, looking at his grandfather's truck preserved in an underground cathedral of automotive history. "I want to call my lawyer," he said finally. Agent Walsh nodded. "Of course, but Mr. Morrison, understand that this site is now under federal protection pending investigation. No one enters or removes anything without authorization." As federal agents began securing the excavation site with crime scene tape and security barriers, Jake realized that his 48-hour deadline had become meaningless. The Sullivan family had played their trump card, using federal connections to seize control of the situation and force Jake into exactly the kind of legal quagmire they'd warned him about. But he was also realizing something else. The Sullivan family's desperation to control this situation suggested they had more to hide than he'd initially understood. Their willingness to involve federal authorities, to risk media attention, to turn a private property dispute into a federal case,
It all pointed to stakes even higher than the $200 million Frank had mentioned. Marcus pulled him aside while the agents were busy establishing their perimeter. "Jake, this isn't over. Federal cases take years to resolve, and there are ways to fight back. But you need to document everything, trust no one completely, and prepare for a long war." "What about the trucks?" "The trucks aren't going anywhere. Earl Henderson built that garage to preserve them for decades, and they'll survive whatever legal battles come next. The question is whether you'll be around to benefit from them when the smoke clears." As the sun set over the excavation site, now transformed into a federal crime scene, Jake Morrison stood beside his grandfather's truck and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't going to be intimidated, bought off, or scared away from what was rightfully his. The Sullivan family might have federal connections and unlimited resources, but Jake had something they couldn't purchase or confiscate: the absolute conviction that he was fighting for more than money. He was fighting for justice, for the memory of men like Earl Henderson and Carl Morrison, and for the principle that sometimes, if you dig deep enough and long enough, the truth really can set you free.
Even if that freedom comes at a price that threatens to destroy everything you hold dear. The discovery was complete, the recognition undeniable, but the real battle was just beginning. 3 weeks into the federal investigation, Jake Morrison sat in Sarah Chen's Indianapolis law office, surrounded by boxes of documents, photographs, and legal briefs that painted a picture far more complex than anyone had initially imagined. Sarah was everything Jake had hoped for in an attorney: brilliant, tenacious, and completely unimpressed by federal intimidation tactics or Sullivan family connections. "Jake," she said, spreading a collection of photographs across her mahogany desk, "what we've uncovered changes everything. The Sullivan family's involvement in this case goes far deeper than a simple desire to acquire vintage trucks." The photographs showed documents from Earl Henderson's personal files, papers that the FBI had been forced to turn over during the discovery process, papers that revealed a conspiracy spanning 6 decades. Earl Henderson didn't just collect trucks, he documented everything: purchase agreements, restoration receipts, insurance appraisals, and most importantly, detailed records of his business relationship with Lawrence Sullivan, Frank's father. Jake studied the handwritten ledgers, the careful documentation of a man who'd built his fortune through meticulous attention to detail. What do they show? They show that Lawrence Sullivan was embezzling from Henderson Transport for at least 2 years before Earl's death. Earl discovered the theft in late 1961 and was building a case against his business partner when he died suddenly in February 1962. Sarah pulled out a particularly damaging document, a letter in Earl's handwriting dated just days before his death. Earl was planning to expose Lawrence Sullivan and have him prosecuted for grand theft. But more than that, he'd discovered that Lawrence was selling information about Henderson transport routes to competitors, essentially destroying the company from within. Jake felt pieces of a 60-year-old puzzle clicking into place. So Earl hid his truck collection to protect it from his business partner. Exactly. And he documented everything, creating a paper trail that would implicate Lawrence Sullivan in multiple felonies. Earl knew he was in danger, so he sealed the collection and created detailed records that he hid in multiple locations. What kind of records? Sarah smiled grimly. The kind that proves the Sullivan family has been lying about this discovery for 3 generations. Financial records, correspondence, even recordings of conversations where Lawrence admits to planning to claim Earl's collection after his death. The implications were staggering. If Sarah was right, the federal investigation that the Sullivan family had initiated to intimidate Jake was about to expose their own family's criminal history. But how does this help us with the current situation? Because, she said, pulling out another document, Earl Henderson's will contained a provision that his truck collection would be donated to the Smithsonian Institution if it was ever discovered after his death. He wanted to ensure that Lawrence Sullivan could never profit from stealing his life's work. Jake stared at the will, feeling both vindicated and disappointed. So the trucks don't belong to me after all. Actually, they do. Earl's will was never properly executed because Lawrence Sullivan, as executor of the estate, claimed the collection had been sold and dispersed. Since the trucks were never transferred according to the will's provisions, and since you discovered them on property you legally own, you have legitimate claim to ownership. The legal complexities were mind-boggling, but Sarah's confidence was reassuring. What about the federal charges?
Dropped. Once we presented evidence of the Sullivan family's historical fraud and their improper use of federal resources to intimidate you, FBI agent Walsh realized he'd been manipulated. The FBI is now investigating the Sullivan family instead of you. Jake felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he'd been carrying for weeks. Where does this leave us? It leaves us in a very strong position. You own the trucks, you have clear title to the property, and you have documentary evidence that the Sullivan family tried to defraud you using falsified federal charges. We can proceed with developing the collection however you choose. That afternoon, Jake drove back to his property for the first time since the federal agents had seized control of the site. The crime scene tape was gone, the security barriers removed, but the underground garage remained exactly as they'd found it. 17 legendary trucks waiting in their concrete cathedral like sleeping giants from America's industrial past. Marcus was already there, along with a team of automotive restoration experts that Sarah had arranged. The sight of professionals carefully examining each truck, documenting their condition and historical significance, filled Jake with a satisfaction he'd never experienced during 20 years of highway driving. "Jake!" Marcus called out, emerging from the underground garage with a grin that stretched across his weathered face. "You need to see what we found in Blue Thunder's sleeper compartment." They climbed down into the garage where restoration expert Linda Martinez was carefully examining Jake's grandfather's truck. She looked up as they approached, her expression a mixture of excitement and amazement. "Mr. Morrison, your grandfather was apparently more than just a truck driver. He was a historian." She led them to Blue Thunder's custom sleeper compartment, where she discovered a hidden panel containing dozens of photographs, documents, and personal letters. The materials painted a picture of the early trucking industry that historians had never seen, first-hand accounts of the men and women who'd built America's freight transportation system from nothing. "These documents are priceless," Linda explained. "Your grandfather documented the development of coast-to-coast trucking routes, the challenges of operating before the interstate highway system, the relationships between independent operators and shipping companies. This is a complete archive of trucking's golden age." Jake picked up a letter in his grandfather's handwriting addressed to Earl Henderson and dated just weeks before both men died. In it, Carl Morrison warned Earl about Lawrence Sullivan's criminal activities and offered to testify in any legal proceedings. It was the missing piece of evidence that connected Jake's family to Earl's story, that explained why Blue Thunder had been included in the collection. "Earl and your grandfather were planning to expose Lawrence Sullivan together," Linda said quietly. "Earl preserved Blue Thunder not just for its historical value, but as a memorial to a man who'd tried to help him seek justice." The emotional weight of the discovery hit Jake like a physical force. His grandfather hadn't just been a truck driver, he'd been a hero, a man willing to risk everything to help a friend fight corruption and theft. And Earl Henderson had honored that courage by preserving Blue Thunder as part of his legendary collection. Marcus put a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you've accomplished here." Over the following months, Jake made decisions that would define not just his future, but the legacy of everyone connected to Earl Henderson's extraordinary collection. Working with the Smithsonian Institution, he established the Henderson-Morrison Transportation Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and displaying the trucks while using them to educate the public about America's trucking history. The foundation's first exhibition, Thunder and Lightning, The Golden Age of American Trucking, opened at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History to unprecedented crowds. 17 legendary trucks, each one representing a piece of industrial heritage that had been presumed lost forever, drew visitors from around the world. But Jake's favorite moment came during the exhibition's opening ceremony, when he stood beside Blue Thunder and told the story of his grandfather's courage, Earl Henderson's vision, and the 3-week period when a broke truck driver's dream of opening a repair shop had uncovered one of America's greatest automotive treasures. The financial benefits were everything Frank Sullivan had promised, and more. Jake's share of the foundation's endowment, combined with licensing deals for books, documentaries, and museum exhibitions, generated enough income to secure his future and the futures of his children and grandchildren. But more importantly, it provided him with something he'd never expected to find, a sense of purpose that went far beyond personal wealth. The truck repair shop became reality as well, built on the same property where Jake had made his extraordinary discovery. Morrison's Heritage Automotive specialized in restoration and maintenance of vintage trucks, drawing customers from across the country who wanted their classic vehicles serviced by the man who'd uncovered Earl Henderson's legendary collection. Tommy Sullivan visited the shop 6 months after the exhibition opened, his demeanor humble and apologetic in a way Jake had never seen before. The federal investigation into his family's activities had resulted in significant fines and the forfeiture of several properties, though criminal charges had been avoided through plea agreements and restitution payments. "Jake," Tommy said, standing in the main service bay where Jake was working on a 1965 Peterbilt 351. "I wanted to apologize for everything my family put you through. We were wrong, and we nearly destroyed something truly important." Jake looked up from the engine he was rebuilding, studying Tommy's face for signs of the arrogance and condescension that had characterized their earlier encounters. What he saw instead was genuine remorse and something that looked like respect. "Your family spent 60 years chasing the wrong thing. You thought it was about money, about owning those trucks. But Earl Henderson wasn't collecting trucks. He was preserving history, honoring the men and women who built this industry." Tommy nodded, understanding for the first time the true significance of what his family had coveted for 3 generations. "What we did to you, the way we tried to intimidate you and steal your discovery, it was inexcusable." "Yeah, it was, but it's over now." Is it? I mean, do you think there's any way my family could contribute to the foundation? Maybe help preserve other pieces of trucking history?" Jake considered the offer carefully. The Sullivan family's local connections and business expertise could benefit the foundation, but trust would have to be earned slowly, carefully, over time. "Maybe," he said finally, "but it would have to be on the foundation's terms, not yours. And it would have to be about preserving history, not profiting from it." Tommy agreed, and over the following years, the Sullivan family's legitimate businesses became major supporters of the foundation's work. Frank Sullivan, approaching 80 and dealing with his own mortality, seemed genuinely committed to atoning for his father's crimes and his own family's decades of attempted theft. But it was Betty Kowalski who provided Jake with the most satisfying moment of vindication. She visited the shop regularly, bringing coffee and stories about the positive changes the foundation had brought to Millbrook. Tourism was up, property values were rising, and the town had a new sense of pride in its connection to trucking history. "You know," she said one afternoon, watching Jake work on a pristine 1952 Kenworth, "Earl Henderson would have loved seeing these trucks being cared for by someone who really understands what they represent." Jake smiled, thinking about the paranoid old man who'd built an underground cathedral to preserve automotive history, never knowing that his careful planning would eventually expose the very corruption he died trying to fight.
The Detroit Exhibition was the Foundation's latest project, a traveling display that would bring Earl Henderson's collection to major cities across the country. Each exhibition drew hundreds of thousands of visitors, educating the public about trucking history while generating revenue that funded additional preservation projects. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the Foundation's director and a woman whose expertise in automotive history had proven invaluable in authenticating and contextualizing their discoveries. "Jake, you need to see the morning news. Something incredible has happened." Jake turned on the small television in his office and found himself watching a CNN report that made his heart race with excitement and disbelief. "In a discovery that echoes the famous Henderson collection found in Indiana 10 years ago," the reporter was saying, "construction workers in California have uncovered what appears to be another underground vehicle preservation facility, this one containing aircraft from the 1940s and 1950s. The report showed aerial footage of an excavation site outside Los Angeles, where bulldozers had accidentally broken through the roof of a massive underground hangar. The brief glimpses of preserved aircraft, P-51 Mustangs, B-25 bombers, even what looked like early jet fighters, suggested a discovery that rivaled Jake's find in scope and historical significance. According to local records," the reporter continued, "the facility was built by aviation pioneer Robert Sterling, who disappeared mysteriously in 1962, the same year that truck collector Earl Henderson died under suspicious circumstances in Indiana." Jake felt a familiar tingling sensation, the same instinct that had led him to keep digging when everyone else told him to stop. He pulled out his phone and called Dr. Walsh. "Jennifer, are you watching this?" "I've been on the phone with the site foreman for the past hour," she replied, her voice tight with excitement. "Jake, this isn't a coincidence. Robert Sterling and Earl Henderson knew each other. They were part of a network of collectors who were preserving American transportation history during the Cold War." "What kind of network?" "We're still piecing it together, but it looks like there were at least a dozen collectors across the country, each one specializing in different types of vehicles and aircraft. They were convinced that America's industrial heritage was being systematically destroyed, so they created these underground preservation facilities to protect the most significant examples." Jake's mind raced with the implications. How many sites are we talking about? Based on the documents we found in Earl's papers, potentially dozens. Ships in underground dry docks near the Great Lakes, locomotives in hidden rail yards, even spacecraft prototypes in facilities we haven't located yet. The discovery in California was just the beginning. Over the following months, Jake found himself at the center of a movement that transformed how America understood its industrial heritage. The Henderson-Morrison Foundation became the coordinating organization for what historians dubbed the Preservation Network, a secret society of Cold War-era collectors who had systematically hidden thousands of historically significant vehicles, aircraft, and machines. Each new discovery brought fresh mysteries and deeper understanding of the period's complex political and social dynamics. The collectors hadn't just been preserving machines. They'd been documenting an entire era of American innovation and craftsmanship that mainstream historians had largely overlooked. Jake's role evolved from shop owner and foundation trustee to something approaching a national figure. He testified before Congress about the importance of industrial heritage preservation, consulted with the Smithsonian on acquisition policies, and found himself featured on the cover of Time magazine as the man who uncovered America's hidden history. But the attention and recognition, while gratifying, weren't what drove him. What mattered was the moment when a young person walked into his shop or attended one of the Foundation's exhibitions and saw something in those preserved machines that connected them to their own heritage, their own possibilities.
Like the teenage girl who spent an entire afternoon studying Blue Thunder's engine, asking detailed questions about compression ratios and torque specifications before revealing that she was planning to study mechanical engineering because she wanted to design the next generation of freight transportation systems. Or the elderly man who wept when he saw the 1953 Peterbilt because it was identical to the truck his father had driven to support their family during the lean years of the 1960s. Or the group of automotive engineering students who used the Foundation's technical documentation to design modern trucks that incorporated the craftsmanship and attention to detail that had characterized the golden age of American trucking. The shop became a pilgrimage site for truckers, historians, and anyone who believed that some things were worth preserving, regardless of their immediate commercial value. Jake estimates that over 100,000 people had visited Morrison's Heritage Automotive in the decade since the discovery, each one carrying away a piece of the story that connected them to something larger than themselves. Marcus Thompson remained Jake's closest friend and business partner, his own trucking operation now serving as the Foundation's official transportation company, moving restored vehicles to exhibitions and newly discovered collections to preservation facilities. Marcus had also become something of a television personality, hosting a popular documentary series called Hidden Highways that explored the untold stories of America's transportation network. "You know what I love most about all this?" Marcus said one evening as they sat in the shop after hours, sharing a beer and watching the sunset paint Blue Thunder's chrome and shades of gold and amber. "We proved that there's still room in this world for guys like us, guys who work with their hands, who understand machines, who believe that some things are worth more than their immediate cash value." Jake nodded, thinking about the journey that had brought him from a laughed-at trucker with impossible dreams to a respected guardian of American industrial heritage. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd listened to Tommy Sullivan that first day, if I'd given up on the repair shop idea and stuck to driving. But you didn't, and that's what makes all the difference. You kept digging when everyone else told you to stop." The Sullivan family had indeed become valuable partners in the Foundation's work, their local connections and business expertise helping to navigate the complex legal and logistical challenges of large-scale preservation projects. Frank Sullivan, now 82, had become one of the Foundation's most generous donors, his contributions funding educational programs that brought trucking history to schools across the Midwest. Tommy Sullivan had transformed his repair business into a specialized restoration facility, working exclusively on vintage trucks and serving as a regional hub for the Foundation's preservation network. The antagonism that had once defined his relationship with Jake had evolved into mutual respect and collaborative partnership. "You know," Tommy had told Jake during the Foundation's annual board meeting, "my family spent 3 generations chasing the wrong dream. We thought wealth came from taking things, from controlling things, from forcing people to give us what we wanted. But what you've built here, this is real wealth. This matters in ways that money never could." Betty Kowalski, now retired from the diner, but still sharp at 79, served as the Foundation's unofficial historian, her memory of Millbrook's past providing crucial context for ongoing research. She had moved into a small apartment above the Foundation's research library, where she spent her days cataloging documents and sharing stories with visitors who wanted to understand the human side of the discovery. Earl Henderson would have loved seeing this, she told Jake during one of their regular coffee sessions, not just the trucks being preserved, but the community that's grown up around them. This is what he dreamed of when he built that underground garage, people caring about the things that built America.
But Jake's proudest achievement was more personal and immediate. His son David, who had initially been skeptical of his father's crazy truck obsession, had graduated from business school and joined the Foundation as its development director. Watching David negotiate complex partnerships with museums, universities, and corporate sponsors gave Jake a satisfaction deeper than any financial success. "I used to think you were wasting your life with all this old truck stuff," David had admitted during the Foundation's 10th anniversary celebration. "But now I understand that you weren't preserving machines, you were preserving dreams, preserving the belief that ordinary people can build extraordinary things."
The anniversary celebration itself had been a testament to how far they'd come. Held at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the event featured all 17 trucks from Earl Henderson's original collection, displayed in a formation that recreated their underground arrangement. Over 50,000 people attended, including truck drivers from every state, museum directors from around the world, and government officials who had come to understand the economic and cultural value of industrial heritage preservation. Jake's speech that day had been simple and heartfelt. 10 years ago, people laughed at the idea of a broken-down trucker opening a repair shop. Today, we're proof that some dreams are worth digging for, worth fighting for, worth preserving, even when others can't see their value. Earl Henderson and my grandfather Carl Morrison believed that America's industrial heritage deserved respect and protection. They were right then, and they're right now. As the years passed, Jake found himself thinking more about legacy and continuity. The foundation was financially secure, the collection was properly preserved, and the educational programs were reaching new generations of students. But what would happen when he was no longer around to guide the work? The answer came in the form of Sarah Morrison Chen, Jake's niece, who had grown up hearing stories about the underground discovery and had decided to dedicate her career to automotive archaeology. With a PhD in industrial history from MIT and specialized training in preservation techniques, Sarah represented the next generation of foundation leadership. "Uncle Jake," she told him during a recent family dinner, "what you've accomplished here is just the beginning. There are probably hundreds of preservation sites still waiting to be discovered, thousands of vehicles and machines that need protection. The network Earl Henderson and his colleagues created was bigger than anyone imagined." Jake smiled, feeling that familiar tingling sensation that had served him well a decade ago. The work would continue, the heritage would be preserved, and new generations would discover that the most extraordinary treasures often lay hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. On a crisp October morning, exactly 10 years after his first excavation, Jake Morrison stood once again on the hill overlooking his property. The underground garage had been converted into a climate-controlled museum space, accessible through a modern visitor center that welcomed over 75,000 people annually. The truck repair shop hummed with activity, its 12 bays filled with restoration projects that represented the finest examples of American trucking craftsmanship. But Jake's attention was focused on something new. A second excavation site where ground-penetrating radar had revealed what appeared to be another underground structure, this one larger and more complex than Earl Henderson's original garage. "What do you think is down there?" asked Dr. Walsh, studying the radar images that showed a vast concrete structure extending deep into the hillside. Jake smiled, feeling that familiar tingling sensation that had served him well a decade ago. Only one way to find out. As he started the excavator and positioned it over the mysterious anomaly, Jake Morrison reflected on the journey that had brought him from a dismissed dreamer to a respected guardian of American heritage.
But the real treasure hadn't been the trucks or the money or the recognition. It had been the validation of a simple principle, that some things are worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth the risk of failure and disappointment. And sometimes, if you're willing to dig deep enough and long enough, you discover that the most valuable legacy isn't what you uncover from the past, but what you build for the future. The bucket bit into the earth, beginning another chapter in a story that had started with laughter and ridicule, but had evolved into something far more significant. Proof that ordinary people with extraordinary persistence can uncover treasures that change the world. Somewhere beneath the Indiana soil, another secret waited to be revealed. And Jake Morrison, no longer the laughed-at trucker with impossible dreams, was ready to dig until he found it. The road ahead stretched endlessly,
filled with possibilities as limitless as the American highway system itself. And for the first time in his life, Jake Morrison knew exactly where that road was leading. Home. To the place where dreams are buried just deep enough to require real effort to uncover, but shallow enough that anyone willing to keep digging can eventually bring them to light. The excavator's engine settled into its familiar rhythm, and Jake Morrison continued the work that had defined his life, digging deeper, building something lasting, and proving that the most extraordinary discoveries often come to those brave enough to ignore the laughter and keep moving forward. The second excavation revealed something that exceeded even Jake's wildest expectations. 3 days into the dig, the bucket struck metal, not the rusted remnants of old farm equipment, but the pristine chrome of what appeared to be another carefully preserved vehicle. But as Jake cleared more earth, he realized this wasn't another truck collection. It was a time capsule of American automotive innovation spanning nearly a century. The underground facility was massive, larger than Earl Henderson's truck garage, with multiple chambers extending in different directions like the branches of a vast underground tree. The main chamber housed vehicles that told the complete story of American transportation. A 1908 Ford Model T that looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line. A 1932 Duesenberg Model J that represented the pinnacle of luxury automotive craftsmanship. A 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air that captured the optimism of post-war America. But it was the far chamber that made Jake's hands tremble as he descended into the depths with his LED lights. Racing cars. Not just any racing cars, but legendary machines that had shaped American motorsports history. A 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, one of only 503 ever built for NASCAR homologation. A 1970 Plymouth Cuda that had dominated Trans Am racing before disappearing from public view. And in the center of the collection, sitting like a crown jewel under custom lighting that still functioned after decades underground, a 1967 Ford GT40 Mark IV, one of only a handful of cars that had actually competed at Le Mans. "This changes everything," Dr. Walsh said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space as she documented each vehicle with scientific precision. "Jake, what you found here isn't just another collection. This is the missing link in American automotive history. These cars represent gaps in the historical record that historians have been trying to fill for decades." The documentation found with the second collection revealed the full scope of what Earl Henderson and his network of preservationists had accomplished. They hadn't just been collecting vehicles, they'd been conducting a systematic rescue operation, acquiring and hiding the most significant examples of American transportation innovation before they could be lost to scrapyards, neglect, or export to foreign collectors. Among the papers was a master list that made Jake's head spin with the implications. 17 underground facilities across the United States, each one containing vehicles from a specific era or category. Ships in underground dry docks near Detroit, aircraft in hidden hangars across the Southwest, even early space program vehicles hidden in facilities that the government had forgotten existed. Earl Henderson wasn't just a paranoid collector. He was a visionary who understood that America was casually discarding its industrial heritage. He and his network spent decades systematically preserving the vehicles that defined our national character.
The financial implications were staggering. Conservative estimates place the value of the second collection at over $500 million, with some individual vehicles worth more than entire museums' collections. The 1967 GT40 alone was valued at $15 million, not for its monetary worth, but for its significance as one of the last American cars to dominate international racing before foreign manufacturers took control of the sport. But Jake had learned enough about the corrupting influence of extraordinary wealth to approach the situation differently this time. Instead of forming a traditional foundation, he worked with Congress to establish the American Transportation Heritage Trust, a government-backed organization that would ensure these discoveries remained in the United States and accessible to the public.
The Trust's first major project was the construction of the American Transportation Museum in Millbrook, Indiana, a 200,000-square-foot facility that would house both the Henderson and Morrison collections, while serving as the hub for ongoing preservation efforts across the country. The museum's design incorporated the original underground chambers, allowing visitors to experience the collections in their preserved state while learning about the secret network that had made their survival possible. Jake found himself appointed as the Trust's first Director of Discoveries, a position that required him to travel across the country investigating potential preservation sites. The work was challenging and often dangerous. Some facilities had been abandoned for so long that their structural integrity was questionable, while others were located in remote areas that required significant excavation efforts. But each discovery brought new revelations about American ingenuity and the dedicated individuals who had fought to preserve it. In Arizona, they uncovered a facility containing prototype aircraft from the early days of aviation. In Louisiana, an underground shipyard housed Civil War-era vessels that had been presumed lost for over a century. In Montana, a hidden rail yard contained locomotives that represented the golden age of American railroad transportation. The most significant discovery came 18 months after the second Millbrook excavation, when ground-penetrating radar revealed a massive facility beneath what had once been the Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan. The underground complex, built during World War II and forgotten after the war's end, contains something that made international headlines: the complete prototype collection of American military vehicles from 1940 to 1960. Tanks, jeeps, aircraft, and experimental vehicles that had shaped the Allied victory in World War II and defined American military superiority during the early Cold War sat in perfect preservation, maintained by automated systems that had continued functioning for decades after the last human had left the facility. What we're looking at here, Jake told the assembled international media, is the physical embodiment of the arsenal of democracy. These vehicles didn't just win World War II. They established America as the world's dominant industrial power. The discovery attracted attention from governments around the world, with several nations offering enormous sums to acquire specific vehicles for their own museums. But Jake and the Trust remained committed to keeping the collections intact and in American hands, recognizing that their true value lay not in individual components, but in the complete story they told about American innovation and determination. The work began to consume Jake's life in ways both rewarding and challenging. He found himself testifying before United Nations committees about cultural heritage preservation, consulting with foreign governments on establishing their own industrial museums, and serving as the public face of what had become the largest archaeological project in American history. But the personal costs were significant. The constant travel strained his relationship with his family, and the pressure of managing discoveries worth billions of dollars took a toll on his health. By his 60th birthday, Jake was dealing with high blood pressure, chronic fatigue, and the kind of stress-related health issues that had claimed many men his age. It was during a routine medical examination that Jake's doctor delivered news that changed his perspective on everything. He had early-stage heart disease, the same condition that had killed his grandfather Carl Morrison at the age of 58.
"You need to slow down," Dr. Patricia Hoffman told him bluntly. "You've accomplished more in the past 12 years than most people achieve in a lifetime. But if you keep pushing at this pace, you're not going to live to see the completion of the projects you've started." The warning forced Jake to confront questions he'd been avoiding about succession, legacy, and the future of the work he'd started. The Trust was thriving, the museum was under construction, and discoveries were being made at an accelerating pace. But what would happen to the vision if its primary advocate was no longer around to guide it? The answer came from an unexpected source: Tommy Sullivan's daughter, Rebecca, who had graduated from Harvard Business School and spent 5 years working for the Smithsonian Institution before approaching Jake with a proposal that would reshape the Trust's future. "Mr. Morrison," she said during their first formal meeting,
What you've built is extraordinary, but it's not sustainable in its current form. You can't personally oversee every discovery, every negotiation, every political battle. You need to create systems and institutions that can continue the work without depending on any single individual. Rebecca's proposal was ambitious and practical. Transform the trust from a discovery-focused organization into a comprehensive preservation network that trained new generations of automotive archaeologists, funded ongoing research projects, and established partnerships with universities and museums worldwide. My family owes you an enormous debt, not just for forgiving my father's mistakes, but for showing us what real legacy looks like. Let me help you build something that will last long after all of us are gone. Jake spent months considering the proposal, consulting with advisors, and examining his own motivations for the work. What he realized was that Rebecca was right. The trust had grown beyond what any single person could manage, and its importance demanded institutional permanence rather than dependence on individual leadership. The transition took 2 years to complete, but by Jake's 62nd birthday, the American Transportation Heritage Trust had evolved into a network of regional centers, university partnerships, and international collaborations that ensured the preservation work would continue regardless of any individual's involvement. Jake remained as chairman emeritus, focusing on the aspects of the work he enjoyed most: hands-on restoration projects, educational programs, and mentoring young people who shared his passion for automotive history. His health improved dramatically once the daily administrative pressures were lifted, and he found himself with time to pursue personal projects that had been set aside during the frantic years of discovery and development. One of those projects became the most personally meaningful work of his life: a complete restoration of Blue Thunder to running condition. Working with Maria Santos and a team of specialist mechanics, Jake spent 18 months returning his grandfather's truck to exactly the condition it had been in during Carl Morrison's final journey in 1962. The restoration process revealed details about his grandfather's life that Jake had never known. Hidden compartments contained personal letters, photographs, and business records that painted a picture of a man who had been not just a truck driver, but an entrepreneur and advocate for independent operators' rights. "Your grandfather was fighting battles that we're still fighting today," Maria observed as they worked on the truck's original Cummins engine. Labor rights, fair compensation, respect for the skill and dedication required to move America's freight. He was ahead of his time. The completed restoration of Blue Thunder marked the beginning of a new phase in Jake's life, one focused on sharing stories rather than making headlines, on preserving wisdom rather than accumulating wealth. He began traveling to truck stops, driving training schools, and industry conferences, using Blue Thunder as a mobile classroom to teach new generations of truckers about trucking's heritage and the values that had built the industry. The truck shows and heritage events became Jake's favorite activities, opportunities to connect with people who understood the passion for machinery and craftsmanship that had driven his entire journey. He met drivers who had learned their trade from men who had known his grandfather, mechanics who had worked on trucks from Earl Henderson's era, and young people who were inspired by the possibility that their own work might someday be considered historically significant. "The most important thing I've learned," Jake told a gathering of transportation students at the museum's 5th anniversary celebration, "is that heritage isn't about the past, it's about the future. Every time we preserve a truck, restore an engine, or share a story about the people who built this industry, we're investing in the possibility that future generations will understand and value the work that keeps America moving." The museum itself had become one of Indiana's most popular tourist destinations, attracting over 300,000 visitors annually and generating substantial economic benefits for Millbrook and the surrounding region. The facility's educational programs reached millions of students through both physical visits and virtual learning platforms, making trucking history accessible to young people across the country. But Jake's greatest satisfaction came from smaller, more personal moments. like the afternoon when a young girl spent hours studying Blue Thunder's engine before announcing that she wanted to become a truck driver like her great-grandfather. Or the day when the group of automotive engineering students used the museum's technical library to design improvements for modern freight transportation systems. Or the moment when an elderly driver broke down crying because seeing the preserved trucks reminded him of his father's pride in the profession. These encounters reinforced Jake's understanding that the real value of what he'd accomplished wasn't measured in dollars or headlines, but in connections, bridges between past and present, between individual stories and collective heritage, between the machinery that moved America and the people who operated and maintained it. As Jake approached his 65th birthday, he found himself thinking more about final legacies and lasting contributions. The trust was secure, the museum was thriving, and the preservation network was expanding internationally. But what would be his personal legacy, the contribution that bore his unique stamp rather than the institutional achievements shared with many others? The answer came during a quiet evening in his workshop, as he fine-tuned Blue Thunder's engine for an upcoming heritage rally. Surrounded by tools, parts, and the familiar smells of oil and metal, Jake realized that his greatest contribution wasn't the discoveries, or the museum, or even the preserved trucks. It was the principle he'd demonstrated through his entire journey, that ordinary people with extraordinary persistence can accomplish things that change the world. That dreams dismissed by others often contain the seeds of transformational discoveries. That the courage to keep digging, even when the ground seems barren, sometimes uncovers treasures beyond imagination. This principle became the foundation for Jake's final major project, the Morrison Fellowship Program, which provided funding and mentoring for young people pursuing careers in automotive archaeology, industrial preservation, and transportation history. The program's first class included students from across the country and around the world, each one selected for their combination of technical skills, historical curiosity, and the kind of determined optimism that Jake recognized from his own journey. What we're looking for, Jake told the Fellowship Selection Committee, isn't just academic achievement or technical expertise. We're looking for people who understand that the most important discoveries often come from following hunches that others dismiss, from investigating possibilities that seem ordinary or unlikely. The fellowship program's success exceeded all expectations, producing graduates who went on to make significant discoveries and contributions to preservation efforts worldwide. Some found new collections hidden in unexpected places. Others developed innovative restoration techniques. And still others created educational programs that brought transportation history to new audiences.
But perhaps the most important outcome was less tangible. The program created a network of young professionals who shared Jake's values and vision, ensuring that the principles he demonstrated would guide preservation efforts for generations to come. On a warm spring morning in his 70th year, Jake Morrison stood once again beside Blue Thunder, preparing for what would be his final long-distance journey in his grandfather's truck. The destination was the new West Coast branch of the Transportation Heritage Museum in Los Angeles, where Blue Thunder would be permanently displayed alongside vehicles from Robert Sterling's aviation collection and other discoveries made by the Preservation Network. The cross-country journey would retrace some of the routes his grandfather had driven in the 1950s, connecting past and present in a way that felt both symbolic and deeply personal. Marcus Thompson would follow in a modern truck, carrying documentation and supplies, while a film crew would record the journey for a documentary about the preservation movement's impact on American culture. As Jake started Blue Thunder's engine and listened to the familiar rumble of the restored Cummins, he reflected on the extraordinary path that had brought him from a dismissed dreamer to a respected guardian of American heritage. The laughter that had once stung so deeply now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the satisfaction of work well done and legacy securely established.
The truck pulled away from Morrison's Heritage Automotive, past the museum where thousands of visitors would soon learn about transportation history, past the Sullivan family's restoration facility where former enemies had become valued partners, past the diner where Betty Kowalski's stories had provided crucial guidance during the early days of discovery. But as Blue Thunder reached the highway and settled into the steady rhythm that had characterized American trucking for generations, Jake Morrison wasn't thinking about the past or even the future. He was focused on the present moment, the feel of the road beneath his wheels, the sound of the engine working in perfect harmony, the endless possibility that stretched ahead like the American highway system itself. Somewhere out there, other dreamers were pursuing visions that others considered impossible. Other diggers were investigating hunches that seemed ordinary or unlikely. Other believers were refusing to accept that the most extraordinary treasures had already been found. And somewhere in the vast network of possibilities that defined American ingenuity and determination, the next great discovery was waiting for someone brave enough to ignore the laughter and keep moving forward. After all, the best treasures are always buried just deep enough to require real effort to uncover, but shallow enough that anyone willing to keep digging can eventually bring them to light.